Welcome to the Hennepin County Bar Association's Rule of Law podcast series, conversations with judges, lawyers, and legal scholars about the principles that form the foundation of our democracy. Each episode is hosted by a leader of the HCBA and explores what the rule of law means, why it matters, and how members of the legal profession can help protect it in a time of challenge and change. Thank you for joining us as we work together to strengthen justice and preserve the rule of law. Welcome to Rule of Law 101. The first episode in a new podcast series from the Hennepin County Bar Association. I'm Jessica Klander, president of the HCBA. This series explores what the rule of law means, why it matters, and how lawyers can help strengthen it in challenging times. I'm joined today by retired Minnesota Supreme Court Justice David Lillehaug and University of Minnesota School of Law professor Jill Hasday. Thank you both so much for being here for our first podcast. All right, let's start with the basics. So when people hear the phrase rule of law, it sounds abstract. How would each of you define what that really means and what we're talking about here today?
Me first? Okay. For me, the rule of law has two parts. The first is how it is law enacted. In a rule of law society, law is enacted through democratic representatives. The processes are clear in advance. It's a relatively transparent system, and the results can be challenged in court. So the first part of the rule of law is how are laws enacted? Does everyone know, and can everyone participate? And the second part of the rule of law for me is how is law enforced? There's an old expression which says a government of laws, not men. I, of course, would update that to a government of laws, not people. But the key insight is that there are rules and they apply to everyone the same way, whether you're the president's cronies, or the president's perceived enemies. And that's a foundational aspect of the rule of law, same rules for everyone.
Wow, that was a great answer. But to answer your question my way, you said you thought it sounded abstract. Well, maybe, but it actually sounds more intimidating, doesn't it? Rule, law. And I really understand it to mean our system of constitutional government in a democratic republic. The foundation of the rule of law is the idea we the people, power to the people, and the corollary that no one is above the law. We hear that so often, but it needs to be true no matter how rich, no matter how powerful, influential, ambitious, holy, or loud is above the law. And I was reminded that when I sat on the Minnesota Supreme Court in the state capitol courtroom, which is the state capitol, one of the great buildings of our country. Go in the capitol courtroom and look up into the dome. And in 4 places in the dome, you see the word Lex, L-A-X. That's not Lex Luthor, that's law. And to me, up in the dome, it says, the law is above us all. And then as you're going out the courtroom, out the back, the famous sign, I think attributable, or phrase attributable to Locke, where law ends, tyranny begins. And you kind of feel when you walk through that door, you're leaving the law and you never know what's on the other side. So that's what I think of. I'm not sure that's a definition, but that's what I feel when I think about the rule of law.
Those are both great definitions. So you both touched on this, I think, but maybe a finer point. Why is this so fundamental to our democracy?
Well, without it, we're not a democracy. The idea is we're to be a democratic republic. And the famous Ben Franklin saying, a republic if you can keep it. And the idea is that the people are to rule, but with due regard for the minority, which has the right to speak, write, associate, vote, worship, and become the majority in the next election. So the idea of the rule of law is kryptonite to people who want to be authoritarians. It's about official accountability, rational, even-handed laws and decisions. Authoritarians don't want that. They don't want them all going one way. And open and accessible proceedings. Authoritarians don't want that either. They don't want to be scrutinized. And if they're criticized, they want the critics to become criminals. And obviously, with 3 branches of government, each branch checking the others. We can talk some more about that, but Professor.
I would echo those points. I would say when you think about why the rule of law is so important, the key question to ask yourself is, what is the alternative? The alternative to the rule of law is rule according to the whims and preferences and prejudices of a small ruling class or even one ruler. That is both, it's unfair because so few people participate. It's unpredictable, you can't tell, and it inevitably ends up serving personal interests rather than the public good.
And I think for lawyers, and that's going to be a lot of our audiences, but also those who aren't. But for those who aren't lawyers, I think something to know about lawyers is we like predictability. We like and expect that when we walk into a courtroom or we do something, that we can understand at least generally what's going to happen. And
Well, yes,
but
authoritarians are extremely predictable.
that's
I mean,
fair.
they have a lot of laws in Russia.
That's true.
They have lawyers in Russia. But the essence of a democratic republic, the essence of the rule of law, is the idea that is the people that are the source of the law, not coming down from the top.
Yeah, and that's true, that it can be extended, it can be modified, and that can come from the bottom up almost, I mean, at some point.
I'm worried in the current context that if the U.S. Supreme Court issues a string of decisions in favor of the president and the idea of the unitary presidency and that he can expand his power dramatically, that he's then going to say, well, we know what the rule of law is now, and if you oppose what I'm doing, you're now against the rule of law. So there's a lot more to the rule of law than just rules and laws.
It's a great point.
And I'll also say that often authoritarian regimes will use the same, both sides will use the same language, so it can become hard for people to see what's going on. In fact, Donald Trump has phrased many of his initiatives as upholding the rule of law, and many of his critics as lawbreakers, which is straight from the authoritarian.
And that public protests are obstructing the rule of law.
Right.
And then we'll see what the next step is in that argument.
Right.
Well, I think that those comments go directly into our next question, the one I have for you, which is, we've heard a lot recently about threats to the rule of law. What kind of pressures or challenges concern you the most right now?
Well, I have a lot. Okay. One is blatant disregard for federal statutes. There's a lot of examples, but I'll just start with the TikTok ban. Congress passed a statute, it was a bipartisan statute, that says TikTok cannot operate in the United States if it's still under Chinese control. The Supreme Court, immediately before Trump's second term, upholds it unanimously. And then what happens? Trump simply does not abide by the law. He promises these private companies, you can have TikTok on your servers and there'll be no consequences. Whatever you think about the TikTok ban on the merits, and I think it's debatable, it's just a striking disregard for a statute. You don't like a statute in America, you go to Congress and you try to get them to pass a new statute. You don't simply say, that's not the rule I would like. My followers like TikTok, I'm not obeying. So I would say, one, blatant disregard for federal statutes. Two, blatant corruption. The cost of accepting a luxury jet from Qatar is not just the $1 billion that the US Treasury will reportedly have to pay to rehab it. It's that it undermines confidence in the integrity of public officials, that they're actually serving the public good rather than enriching themselves. And there's a lot of evidence from around the world that corruption spreads like contagion. If there's a perception of corruption at the top, then sooner than you think, we're a country where you have to give a bribe to the DMV, to get your license, which is routine in many countries in the world, that, bribes kind of power government. Another thing that concerns me is the deployment of US troops in US cities. Why is that concerning? One of the core ideas in American law is that the US military does not operate domestically. The founders were so afraid of a standing army that you cannot have appropriations for the military that last more than 2 years. Why is it so dangerous to have the military in the United States? There's a lot of reasons, but one is the military is not trained to respect the citizenship, the constitutional rights of U.S. citizens on U.S. territory. That's just not how they're trained to operate. The Constitution doesn't apply abroad if you're, invading another country. It's very dangerous to have a force that's not trained in constitutional rights in the United States. And it sets up the idea that any critic is a potential enemy that can be attacked as if we're at war. And to me, I relate ICE's use of military-like tactics are similarly concerning. Obviously, if people don't have a legal right to be in the United States, that's something you can pursue through legal mechanisms. But the key is through legal mechanisms, not through military-like tactics. People have a right to due process. And it's actually, in some ways, not only about them, it's about constraints on the government. How is the U.S. government allowed to act? It's supposed to act with due process, because otherwise, what is the check on the enormous power the federal government holds?
Let me put kind of a personal slant on it. A really formative experience for me in high school and college was watching the Watergate scandal. Now, that's many years ago. But I really think we're in a threatening situation that is worse than Watergate. In Watergate, the president was a lawyer. Many of the people around him were lawyers. Many of them committed crimes. But then there were lawyers who came in and said no to the president, advised him to at least comply with a Supreme Court order, and eventually the crisis worked its way through the legal system. This situation seems to me to be scarier. The big issue being the separation of powers and its sibling checks and balances. In less than a year, this president has moved very quickly and very forcefully to go to the limits of constitutional power and perhaps beyond. The Supreme Court will be telling us about that. The complication here, though, is you've got a very deeply divided Congress, and unlike the good bad old days of Watergate, neither party seems very independent, and the members don't seem very independent to be able to say what needs to be said. And then you've got the Supreme Court, which is, let's face it, it is not evenly divided. The court has the power under Marbury versus Madison and the duty to say what the law is. But it looks like the trend is going one way. Now, maybe I'll be wrong, maybe tariffs, maybe birthright citizenship, maybe there'll be some room there, but I think there's going to be a streak of wins for the president. Now, a related problem is how the president talks about the judiciary, even about the Supreme Court, where he appointed a lot of the members. If he wins a court case, he thanks the judge for loyalty, not for great legal reasoning. And if he loses a court case, then the judge is disloyal, corrupt, or at best has a low IQ. The entire subtext, though, is that judging is about power and personality, not what it should be about precedent and principle. So when the president speaks like that, his words further energize the digital platoons out there that are threatening judges by name and address, and that's happening a lot.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I guess I wanted to follow up on one thing that you mentioned on Watergate, which is, when you were living through that, was it as divisive as it is now? Were there people who were staunchly, supporting the president? I think that's something that's very remarkable, at least for me, living through this time.
Yeah, we were divided. And we were also the Vietnam War was going on. So that was a major, major division.
Right.
And there was violence in the streets, and there were hundreds and thousands and millions of people in the streets. But when the facts came out about what President Nixon did, not just with the burglary, but the cover-up, the hush money, the perjury, and on, then at that point, there were adults in the room. Right. Senator Barry Goldwater, who had run for president in 1964, far right wing, or at least back then. He was one of those who stepped in, some of the other elders in the Senate. And President Nixon accepted their advice and resigned. And I just don't see that happening, no matter what the facts are on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, one of the limitations of the constitutional system the founders set up, and of course they don't have full, predictive knowledge of the future, is it turns out to be extraordinarily difficult to impeach a president unless you have the support of members of his own party. It took a while for Republicans to come out against President Nixon, but eventually they did. And that's what drove him out. I also think that Nixon had a much more developed sense of shame than Donald Trump. At a certain, he did not want to be impeached. He would,
And you mentioned the facts coming out. There was an agreement that there needed to be a bipartisan committee in the Senate to look into the set of scandals called Watergate. And people had a chance to watch that, and they weren't divided into 5,000 channels. All the networks were carrying it. And then with the House impeachment proceedings, and that was watched day by day. I'd come home from working as a busboy, and I'd turn on the TV and at least until midnight and watch the rerun of the Watergate hearings.
I know my parents watched it when my dad was a law student. Something else that I'll just say.
Yeah, we're nostalgic for Watergate.
Yeah, I know. But after Watergate, a lot of reforms were passed that were very helpful. But many of the most important reforms after Watergate were actually changes in norms rather than law. So, for instance, after Watergate, there was a very strong norm established that the president shouldn't play a role in individual prosecutorial decisions. He can have a general policy. I'm going to be tough on drugs. I'm not going to prosecute marijuana or something like that. But that he wouldn't be naming people to go after or not to go after. The problem is that was always a norm. And if you're not someone who's sensitive to norms, that's not going to stop you. So I think one of the lessons we have today is that the post-Watergate reforms were not as strong as people might have hoped or thought.
Yeah, in kind of an eerie and troubling way, what's happening now is mirroring what happened during Watergate with DOJ. You had the Attorney General of the United States involved in a cover-up. And the IRS. Let's go look into the tax returns of our enemies. And the president mentioned the IRS the other day.
Well, I mean,
these are agencies that are supposed to be at least somewhat insulated from political pressure.
And even in the first term, the Comey and his deputy in the FBI were both subject to investigations by the IRS that tax accountants call autopsy without the benefit of death because they're so painful. And there was a study that the Inspector General found that it was not directly targeted, but apparently the odds of them both being picked were like 8 million to 1. So I don't know. I guess that's hard to accept that it was random.
Well, something that you both touched on when you were talking is the misinformation, the various points at which we're getting information now from different sources, whether they're good or bad or indifferent. But how does that misinformation coming from the top or coming from these sources and attacks on the judiciary affect public confidence in our legal system?
Well, let's see, was it Federal 78 that said that the executive has the power of the sword, the legislature has the power of the purse, and what does the judiciary have? Basically trust, if it is there. And so I think when the President of the United States ridicules the judiciary, public trust is diminished. And public trust is everything. This is not to say the judicial branch and individual judges can be immune from scrutiny. There needs to be thoughtful criticism. They need to be held accountable. But on the other hand, sending the dogs out to dox the judge and deliver a pizza to the judge's door, let them know where the judge lives, that's going a step beyond. And it raises the real fear of intimidation, but it also raises the perception of possible intimidation. And then calls into question, did the judge really decide this case on the merits?
I agree with all of that. And this might be a little too inside baseball, but I think that the Supreme Court has made a big mistake in issuing some decisions that will reverse, 90-page judgments from the district court with like a 1-paragraph emergency decision.
You're referring to the Oregon case just decided by the Ninth Circuit?
There's more than one example, but because I think that plays into a narrative of, well, maybe the Supreme Court can be trusted, but not the whole judiciary. The judiciary is a very important bulwark on the rule of law, because when you think about who are the organizations to stop the political branches from going too far, the judiciary is a very important mechanism for that to actually happen. And as the justice was saying, all the Supreme Court has is that we believe in them. That's all they have.
Well, and then that raises the question, what can the Supreme Court be doing to enhance confidence in the judiciary? And I think if you've got a court that says we're going to have clear standards of ethics and disclosure, we're going to have our proceedings accessible, and we're going to explain the reason for our decision. That 93-page decision out of with dissent and concurrence out of the Ninth Circuit, at least they wrote something down. The Supreme Court shadow docket, they're saying nothing. And how judges are appointed and how, or at state level, how they're elected, that matters as well. So each of the branches needs to uphold its obligation to encourage an independent and professional judiciary.
I agree.
Well, we've talked about this a lot already as well, but the Constitution is often invoked in political debates. And I think that there is use of it that is somehow divisive, something that's supposed to be a framework for us all. But how do people distinguish between the Constitution as a legal framework versus a political symbol?
I think the Constitution is both. The Constitution is the supreme law of the United States. It's a source of constraints on government power. Congress cannot abridge free speech, for instance. Everyone is protected, is guaranteed equal protection of the law. They're supposed to be treated with due process. But I think it's also, what does it mean to have a written constitution? The United States was the first country in the world to have a written constitution. Now it seems old hat, but it was actually an innovation. And I think it was a real way of marking us off as a new nation and saying, again, in this nation, we're going to be a country of laws, not men. We're setting out in advance what can and cannot happen. Very much alert to what is the founders' fears. I mean, they have a lot of fears, but one of their fears is that the exigencies of the moment, the popular enthusiasms will override sounder judgment and better processes. So many presidents have complained about the inefficiencies of the Constitution. The Constitution says we have a pretty inefficient system. But the insight, which I personally agree with, is doing things fast and exactly how you want it is not always the best strategy. Actually, it's better to have a system that requires both houses of Congress to participate and for a law to have to go through Congress and the president. It slows it down, but it also gets more voices and tends to kind of cut off extreme ideas.
Well, I agree. Of course, the Constitution is both law and it's a political symbol of Republican democracy. But I was thinking in the last couple of weeks, people have been talking about the Constitution almost in sort of a Y2K sense. My God, we're going to hit 250 years. And they disintegrate after 250 years. Maybe, but it's been pretty durable thus far. And as Justice Barry Anderson the other day for Constitution Day recited, we've had a lot of constitutional crises. I mean, even in this discussion of whether in Oregon they're having an insurrection where the president can use troops, the briefs talk about Shays Rebellion and a couple other rebellions. Insurrection is not unknown in the United States, and January 6th, I would say, should count.
We had a civil war.
By the way, there was a civil war.
There was that thing too.
I'm talking about lesser insurrections.
Sure.
So we shouldn't be saying 250, that's some magical number where it's just not going to work anymore. I do think there are more disputes now, both academically and in the political realm, about how to read the Constitution. Originalism, traditionalism on the one hand, prudentialism, reliance on precedent on the other. I'm noticing that seeping into social conversations with people who are not lawyers. The other day I was talking about, somebody brought up tariffs and their effect on the economy, and an investment advisor said, oh yeah, Article 1, Section 8. Whoa, I'm at dinner and Article 1, Section 8 is being cited. People are getting up to speed pretty quickly here.
Yes, well, and I mean, AI, you can Google or not Google, ChatGPT something and learn whether that's right or not is one thing, but that's one of the issues we have is just good information and where to get it, which is actually part of what this is all about. So on that issue, which is common misconceptions that people have, and I think including lawyers, that people have about constitutional rights and the court's role in interpreting them. What are some of those common misconceptions?
I guess I would say people have a misconception. It's sort of the opposite of what the justice said, which is I think people often assume the Constitution is safe and secure on its own. It's sitting in the National Archives and it's there. And in fact, each generation has to defend it. I'll say in my own work, I'm an anti-discrimination scholar. When I started, I thought the background music is there's been progress, but it's been too slow and too small. And now I think actually just as much as there's a fight for progress, it's actually a fight against regression. Because if you look over the course of American history, the forces of regression are often quite strong. We're in a moment of potential regression. It's not actually, I think, really a moment about progress. It's about fighting regression. And that is part of that job is the courts, but it's not just the courts. It has to be everyone for it to work.
Yeah, and I'm not saying this isn't a crisis. I was just saying we need to be careful about applying some magical number or getting into numerology.
I agree with that, yes. I agree with that.
So people do have a lot to learn about the Constitution. Weird way, National Treasure, the movie, really affected my daughter's generation. A lot of these kids went to National Treasure, so they started thinking about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but
is that the one where there's a secret code on the back of the Declaration of Independence?
Oh yes, yeah. I think it was lemon juice, and so you had to heat up the Declaration of Independence and read what was on the back. And the idea of bringing a flame close to the Declaration was problematic.
That's no problem.
I think that's about all I have to say.
I think that's perfect. This year, Minnesota lawyers and judges came together for events like the National Law Day of Action and Constitution Day, where Justice Lillehaug actually spoke. And more than 600 lawyers and judges in Minnesota have now signed on to an open letter supporting the Constitution and the rule of law. Are these important things? Do they make a difference? We talk a lot about what can people do when they are feeling helpless in situations where it feels like a crisis is happening. Are those important moments, and why?
I think it's been an extremely important moment in the two events that I've been to with lawyers. There's a wise old supervisor in the U.S. Attorney's Office who, when met with a complicated case or fact situation, would just say, stop. Let's keep the main thing the main thing. And when lawyers talk about having raised their right hands and sworn to defend the Constitution, by the way, the Constitutions, United States and the state, in this case Minnesota, that's the main thing. That's what it's about. You may be pretty busy with ERISA law right now, or figuring out whether crypto is a security, but the main thing is the rule of law and how our entire legal profession is grounded on that. And I felt the same way. I took a swing by the No Kings demonstration. I just wanted to see 4 city blocks filled. I've never seen that in Minneapolis before. And these were not fringe people. They were just ordinary people that said, I don't have any way of voicing my concern here, so I came today. And there were a lot of signs invoking the rule of law. When was the last time you saw that? Powerful forces at work.
There's a remark that's attributed to Benjamin Franklin, although it's not clear whether he said it. But at the Declaration of Independence's signing, he's supposed to have said, we must all hang together or we'll all hang separately. There's never been a democracy as wealthy and well-established as the United States that has collapsed. It would be very hard to end American democracy. If we all stand together, it would be very, very hard. The only way to do it is for people to give up in advance or think they can't make a difference. There's been a lot of slide towards authoritarianism in the last few months. It's remarkable speed, but to actually end the rule of law in the United States would be, I think, extraordinarily difficult with consolidated popular opposition.
And lawyers play a big part in that, which also is a challenge to the legal profession. Are lawyers going to duck these current issues, or are they going to stand up and say what they think, regardless of which side or sides they're on? I was horribly disappointed when some law firms buckled immediately, and they thought they were being so smart in settling with the President of the United States and doing pro bono work apparently of his choosing and in great money and value as well. They were so smart. They treated it like a business transaction with a failing company. Well, the United States is not a failing company, and these lawyers are not bankruptcy lawyers circling the carcass. Lawyers need to stand up and say what they think and read the constitutions, get up to speed, and be authors, not authoritarians.
I couldn't agree more. And I was at both of those events, and I was pleasantly surprised at how powerful those were and how meaningful they were. I thought it was important to show up. I wanted to be there and to be with a large group of attorneys. And I knew a lot of people there who I know personally and knew were all along the political spectrum. They weren't all just in my echo chamber, who were there for the same reasons. And for me, that was a really powerful moment. And I agree that if not us, then who is sort of what I keep asking. I'm in a smaller firm, so I didn't have quite but we are a very diverse group of attorneys, politically at least, and there was a very unanimous sort of, if not us, then who? We are lawyers, that's our job. Even if we don't practice, I don't practice constitutional law, I'm not in that area, but it does feel like the arc of history. I want to look back, and you got to look at where were you sitting at that moment and what were you doing. And as lawyers, I think there's a little bit bigger obligation to be doing something in this moment in particular. So I guess that leads maybe to the next conversation, which is, why should this conversation matter to every lawyer? Not just those in public office, not those just in the court systems or practicing in constitutional law or civil rights. Professor.
You may not think of yourself as a constitutional lawyer. You may not be a practicing lawyer, but I can assure you that your work and your ordinary life depends on maintaining the rule of law. Just to give one simple example, maybe you're doing you do deals all day. Why did the United States become such an economic powerhouse? Because we had a secure and stable legal system that allowed people from other countries to invest here, that allows people to go to school confident you can have the payoff. Without the rule of law, authoritarians don't do well economically. There's reason authoritarianism is associated, for instance, with hyperinflation. If you think the rule of law isn't important to you, all I want to say is just you wait. It will be. Now's the time to act.
I agree.
I agree as well. So what are some practical ways that individual lawyers can support the rule of law?
Well, we've already talked about standing up when judges are maligned unfairly, and emphasizing that even if we disagree with a judicial decision, if it's reasoned, if it's based on precedent, we respect it and we move on to the next case. And this idea that we base judicial decisions on precedent, I'm really watching the Supreme Court very closely here, because it used to be you were an activist judge if you disregarded precedent and struck out on your own. And now suddenly things seem to have been turned around quite a bit. And so, for example, the case of the Commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission, the Slaughter case, it looks like if the court's going to go the president's way and say he had the power to remove her, they're going to have to overturn a precedent from 1929. The same way with Citizens United, they overturned, I think, 3 what I thought were binding precedents. So speak up for the judiciary. Participate in judicial selection programs to the extent you can, or in judicial elections in states that have them. because every lawyer should want a fair, impartial, and scholarly judge to appear before. And then, in a broader way, advocate for the voting rights, because the rights of voting, free speech, and association, those are really the rights that make us a democratic republic. Those are some of the things I do, or try to do.
I would just say, look for opportunities to kind of borrow the 9/11 phrase. If you see something, say something. When you see something happening in the bar, in an area of law that you're dealing with, if there's an opportunity to be on a committee, seize that opportunity. Look for chances.
I think sometimes I get into a mode where Minnesota can feel a little bit isolated or insulated from some of what is more the crazier things that are going on.
For now, is what I would say.
Things that happen that remind me that is not the case also. But yes, I think that is the important thing to remember, that it is for now and not to be that way for long, potentially. So how can we talk about this? The dinner table, holidays are coming up. Those are always everybody's fun times, especially with people who may have a very different perspective on this or a different source of news.
Well, I'm going to jump in on this one because we may or may not have that situation in my family.
That may or may not be the case for me as well.
So I am considering how to conduct myself as we go through these holidays. Sometimes it's better to start such conversations by focusing first, maybe not on the U.S. Constitution, but our own constitutions. And by that I mean acknowledge that we come from different places, try to focus on the common good, let others talk, hard for lawyers to let others talk, listen carefully, show respect for opposing views, and remember the three words that start with C: courtesy, candor, and compromise. So I think we lawyers need to exercise kind of a light touch. That doesn't mean there aren't opportunities to educate one another and, in fact, maybe persuade one another. But we've got to be careful. We don't want to ruin a long-term relationship over one issue.
I really like that answer, and it also seems very Minnesotan to me. Not as a native Minnesotan. Yeah, I agree with everything that Jessica said. I guess the only other thing I would add is to think about whether there's topics on which you might agree, and if that's a baseline for working from there. So I personally, I wouldn't start with maybe immigration enforcement, but I would start with like cuts to cancer research and how that could be a sign of, that's something that's very popular. No one campaigned on cutting cancer research, but it shows that when you have a system where there's not checks, there's no stop, right? It'll hit something that can be very popular and can really do a lot of good. And that might be a potential way in. I wouldn't start with something where the other person agrees with the substance of the policy, because I think it's often hard for people to separate substance from procedure.
Oh, that's a great point. I think that is, it's sort of like even 20 years ago, you wouldn't talk about abortion because that's going to be immediately the thing that people are going to be on the other side, opposite sides on. But, like right now there's, cutting funding and disability resources and things that generally touch everybody everywhere. And most people would agree, yeah, we're in support of that. And they're surprised to hear that that's something that's happening because there's so much noise right now that it's hard to even keep up with all of the many, many things that are happening that aren't getting the time in the news.
I wasn't going to mention this, but I have to now. The professors brought it up. And that is the coarsening of discourse in American society. Now, I know I'm going to sound like an old curmudgeon. We talked much better in the old days. But what people say now in the political context in the public square is often shocking to me. I worked when I was about 30 years old for a year traveling with Walter Mondale, a great Minnesotan. And he ran for president against Ronald Reagan and just got decimated.
Except in Minnesota.
By 5,000 votes.
Oh, really? I didn't know it was that close.
It was close. And that night, he congratulated President Reagan and conceded. And President Reagan responded courteously, and they'd had a couple of debates, and they were courteous to each other. They were civil to one another. And so I think not just with your relatives, but it's caused me when I hear a response to a political attack that drops an F-bomb and says the other person's corrupt. We've got to be more careful what we say about each other.
Yeah, I always remember the story too, George W. Bush leaving a note for Barack Obama that was supportive and I think even at that time it was felt divisive at that time to me, but it was still there was a professionalism, a courtesy as professionals back and forth that it just feels is lacking right now.
To do my own version of curmudgeon, I think it's important to get out of social media and into real life. To me, part of the corseting is the social media algorithms reward very extreme statements that gets a lot of engagement, etc. And to think about, would I actually say this to someone's face? Probably not. Maybe I shouldn't say it on social media. I think that's part of what's going on.
That is true. So if you could leave our listeners with one thought, one takeaway, maybe an action item, what would it be? Professor, you look like you were ready to speak.
I'm very optimistic. America has gone through many hard times and we've survived. We can do this too. It's important to think about not only this day, this week, this month, but the years to come. Every important battle has usually taken generations to achieve, and we are in a battle that is immediately, but it's also over the next few years. And America, the rule of law has survived, and we can survive this too.
Well, I think we can survive if we can vote, and all of us who have voting rights can exercise them. There are midterm elections coming up next year. That will tell us a lot about where the country's going. Or if they are disrupted, say by the presence of military in the area, that will tell us something about where the country's going also. And if the Supreme Court says no state can accept mail-in ballots that arrive the day after the election, that's going to tell us something about where the country's going. If the Supreme Court declares the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, unconstitutional because it discriminates on the basis of race, and it upholds the recent Eighth Circuit holdings that there's no private cause of action for people whose rights have been taken away, no private cause of action under the Voting Rights Act, that's going to tell us whether we should be optimistic or pessimistic. I'm probably a little more pessimistic than my friend here.
Well, that's why these conversations are so important. We are going to be continuing to have these conversations on different topics over the course of the next year on the rule of law. But I want to thank you both so much. Thank you, Justice Lillehaug. Thank you, Professor Hasday, for joining us today and sharing your perspectives. Thank you to everyone listening. This conversation kicks off our HCBA Rule of Law podcast series. Watch the Hennepin Lawyer for future episodes exploring how lawyers, judges, and citizens can help strengthen the institutions that uphold justice in Minnesota and across the nation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.